All right. Hi, Kathy. I sound, I need to call you all back to order, don't I? Look at that. Hey, I've got some fans in the audience. In fact, I've managed to bring a bit of a renter crowd. My mum and dad actually are up the back there today. Let's give them a welcome. And actually, there is another thing that I think it's worth announcing that perhaps got missed in the announcement, Sandra. We have had an engagement in our midst. So Daniel and Sarah, whereabouts are you? There, woohoo! Come and stand up so we can see you. Come on. We've been waiting a long time for this moment, but I'm glad it's here now. Actually, I think, Andrew and Caroline, you've come today as well. Look at that, I'm a massive renter crowd. I've got some real fans. All right, so, but it's not about me. All right. Isn't it? Preaching's a funny thing. You know, I've only done this a few times, but I think the thing I'm learning is you have to be true to who you are. I can't be anybody else. What you see is what you get, okay? So this is how I am. It was funny, last time I preached, I think my kids were texting stuff around. They're saying, Dad's doing stand-up, you know. That wasn't what I was doing. I was just being me. I think when we come to God's Word, you know, I think it's good actually to be excited. It's good to be expectant because God's Word itself is actually living and active. It actually nourishes and feeds us. But I think it also needs to capture our attention at times, and it's just brilliant the way that he does that. I've had so much fun preparing. I feel like I've been preparing for 3 weeks. Oh, good. All right, thank you. Kai got there a bit sooner. Now, why are we seeing this on the screen? The passage today that we're doing, in fact, is a bit of a dark time. There's a moment, now this one's actually for Simon, this one I put this animation, I've been learning a bit more about PowerPoint. But if you remember Star Wars, my mum took me to see Star Wars in 1977. And that was an amazing moment, if anyone remembers seeing Star Wars for the first time. And there's this kind of, you know, slow crawl of this writing, and it's like we didn't know what we're in for. There was a moment in that first Star Wars movie where it's like, these are dark days for the rebellion, weren't they? Remember that? It was like, ooh. And you sort of enter into this whole sort of saga, and then that episode was later entitled A New Hope. But that's kind of what it was. And I feel like today, the passage that we're actually reading together is a bit like that. There's a moment where it's like we think, wow, could things get any darker? And they possibly are. And yet, you know, God is actually wanting us to see something more in this moment. And I wanted to let's just consider for a moment. This is the book that Matthew wrote. When he was writing this book, his audience, you know, this is like 2,000 years ago. They didn't have the same frame of reference that we have now. But he was telling the story of Jesus. There was 3 years of incredible ministry. In fact, maybe a little more. And there was healings. There was kind of people getting raised from the dead. There were, lives being completely transformed. It was an incredible period on the earth. And it all seemed to culminate in this kind of this week, in fact. So, Kai, do you just want to bring that next slide up? You're not going to be able to read this. It's way too small. I understand that. I don't expect you to. It looks a little bit like a Sydney train kind of network, doesn't it? With all the colours. But you can see that box that Kai's kind of now showing around that section. This really is the last week of Jesus' life on earth. There's a lot going on. Okay, I'll point out a couple of things because you can't see them and they're way too small. But in this time period, you had things like the very beginning of the week, where the Bible talks about the triumphal entry. You had Jesus riding a donkey. The crowds came out to meet him. This was festival week in Jerusalem. People had traveled from far and wide. Literally thousands of people had come to celebrate the Passover that week in Jerusalem. There were massive crowds. Jesus came in on this donkey. People are kind of putting palm branches before him. There's a great excitement. And everyone's thinking, who is this guy? So, I imagine the disciples all sort of thinking, oh, wow, our moment's finally come. And in a way, their moment had come, but not in the way they expected it. There were times in there where Jesus cleansed the temple. He took a whip. And in fact, let's bring this next slide up just so you can see a little bit clearer. We're going to come to this part. This is the section that we're going to be talking about primarily. But there was a moment where Jesus cleared the temple of the money changers. He's turning over tables, and he completely upset the status quo of what was going on at the time. And there were times of debate. Jesus was teaching in the courts. There was thousands of people thronging to listen to him, amazed at the incredible capacity that he had to teach. And he just put the other rulers and leaders to shame in the way that he approached things. But this section of Jesus' life that we're going to look at here now, in fact, is less than 24 hours. It's a tiny little window, but it's perhaps an incredible pivot point for what the kingdom of God was all about. So this little part here we're looking at, we're sort of seeing the Last Supper has just happened. Judas has kind of slipped out. There's a moment Jesus takes the disciples, they go to the Mount of Olives to pray in the Garden of Gethsemane. And we're going to talk a little more about that through the service, through this preach. But the passage we're going to read comes from this incredible time where Judas turns up with a bunch of thugs, really, to arrest Jesus. And there's this moment of arrest, and then there's a moment too of where the trial begins. And Jesus' revolution is in fact put on trial. So that's really what we're going to be covering today. And I want, actually, I was going to, Beth's looking at me, Dad, don't. But anyway, she doesn't know what I'm going to do. Beth went to Mercy College, and there was a lovely school. But the one thing, their song kind of collection wasn't that large, really. So the one song that I always remember Beth singing and that she loved was a song called Ancient Words. Does anyone know Ancient Words? Who remembers it? Oh, look, it's got some up the back. But the song, it said, ancient words ever true, changing me and changing you. We have come with open hearts, so let these ancient words impart. And that's how I want us to come. That's actually a beautiful prayer. That's how I want us to come now when we're reading God's word together. Now, you're going to see something in Portuguese. I have no idea whether I've managed to pick the Portuguese equivalent of the King James Version or if it's something a bit more modern, but hopefully our wonderful Brazilian family can enjoy reading along as well in their own language. But let's read together. While he was still speaking, Judas, one of the 12, arrived. With him was a large crowd armed with swords and clubs, sent from the chief priests and the elders of the people. Now the betrayer had arranged a signal with them. The one I kiss is the man. Arrest him. Going at once to Jesus, Judas said, "Greetings, Rabbi," and kissed him. Jesus replied, "Do what you came for, friend." Then the men stepped forward, seized Jesus, and arrested him. With that, one of Jesus' companions reached for his sword, drew it out, and struck the servant of the high priest, cutting off his ear. Oh, I've lost my spot. 26. Cutting off his ear. Okay, and iPads are fantastic when they work for you. All right. Here we go. "Put your sword back in its place," Jesus said to him, "for all who draw the sword will die by the sword. Do you think that I cannot call on my Father and he will at once put at my disposal more than 12 legions of angels? But how then would the scriptures be fulfilled that say it must happen this way?" In that hour, Jesus said to the crowd, "Am I leading a rebellion that you have come out with swords and clubs to capture me? Every day I sat in the temple courts teaching, and you did not arrest me. But this has all taken place that the writings of the prophets might be fulfilled." Then all the disciples deserted him and fled. Those who had arrested Jesus took him to Caiaphas, the high priest, where the teachers of the law and the elders had assembled. But Peter followed him at a distance, right up to the courtyard of the high priest. He entered and sat down with the guards to see the outcome. The chief priests and the whole Sanhedrin were looking for false evidence against Jesus so they could put him to death. But they did not find any, though many false witnesses had come forward. Finally, 2 came forward and declared, "This fellow said, 'I'm able to destroy the temple of God and rebuild it in 3 days.'" Then the high priest stood up and said to Jesus, "Are you not going to answer? What is this testimony that these men are bringing against you?" But Jesus remained silent. The high priest said to him, "I charge you under oath by the living God, tell us if you are the Messiah, the Son of God." You can almost feel a pause in this moment. Jesus, remember, had been largely silent up until this point. You can almost hear a pause. And he's saying, and then he stops, because he knows in this moment how he answers will determine his fate. And he also knew that when he answered the question, their interpretation of what he was saying and what the role of the Messiah actually was poles apart from what his understanding was. Nevertheless, Jesus replied, "You have said so, but I say to all of you, from now on you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the Mighty One and coming on the clouds of heaven." Then the high priest tore his clothes and said, "He has spoken blasphemy. Why do we need any more witnesses? Look, now you've heard the blasphemy. What do you think?" "He is worthy of death," they answered. Then they spit in his face and struck him with their fists. Others slapped him and said, "Prophesy to us, Messiah, who hit you?" This is a fairly bleak moment, isn't it? I wonder whether you would want on your resume, "I was the first person to strike the Son of God in the face." It's a dark, dark time. And yet, it actually is the time that, for us, in fact, creates the conditions by which we can have a relationship with God. When I read a passage like this, I kind of came through and I put down 5 questions. And maybe if Kai, you want to bring these questions up now. Okay, so my first question was, why did Jesus have to die? You think, he was a good teacher, wasn't he? We went around doing good. He was healing people. Why did this guy have to die? The second question I wanted to consider when I looked at it was there any other way for this, to actually happen? Was there any other way to God? Why did Jesus go through with this? And then the other question I have when I read something like this is I look at someone like Judas. He was just a person like you and me. He'd followed Jesus around for 3 years, and he said, and I have to ask myself, why did Judas betray Jesus? And then I've got another question, and this one is perhaps something that we can also draw strength from if we understand the answer. How did Jesus endure such cruelty and such injustice? And the last question really comes out of kind of what happens ultimately to Peter. I'm going to touch on this briefly today, but this is actually what Sandra's going to primarily pick up on next week. So I've got to be careful not to preach your sermon for you, Sandra. But is it possible to be restored after missing the mark so badly? So these are all questions that were kind of bubbling through my mind as I was reading this passage. And we're going to actually try to answer them today. So in trying to answer them, let's just jump, Kai, to this next slide. I'm going to look at the question in 2 ways here, okay? So the first question is, why did Jesus have to die? Now, what you're seeing there is a map of what often gets talked about as being the known world. Okay, and it wasn't really. The world, there was obviously a lot more people living in the world even in these days, 2,000 years ago. But this kind of sets out the rough boundaries as we understood them of what was the Roman Empire at the time Jesus was alive. Now, the Roman Empire was quite a remarkable thing. In fact, my friend Andrew is Greek by heritage. The Greeks, in fact, preceded the Romans, didn't they, Andrew? And the Greeks there was a guy called Alexander the Great. And I love a bit of history, so we're going to do a little bit of history. You just have to trust me, it's going to be fun. All right. Who enjoyed history at school? Was there? Oh, good. We've got some historians in the room. Love it. All right. So the Greeks were quite a remarkable civilization. They invented what became democracy, and we still have obviously democracy in many parts of the world today, thankfully. But they had this. There was a guy, Alexander the Great, who conquered vast kind of amounts of territory. He even got as far, apparently, I think, to India in terms of his conquest. A remarkable fellow, but died very young. When he died, the Greeks kind of carried on for a while, lost their way a little bit, maybe lost their edge. And the new kids on the blocks were the Romans. And so the city-state of Rome began to grow and prosper, and they began to push out. And they, in fact, took over not just the Greek Empire, but they extended further as well. And they did quite an effective job at governing. But the Greeks had also prepared the way in terms of language. The language of Greek was the language of business, the language of commerce. If you needed to get anywhere in the Empire of Rome, you actually could get by with Greek. If you could speak Latin, that was great, but the Greeks actually kind of gave us this common language. And that was the context of when Jesus was born and the gospel began to spread out. And so in his travels in the early church, the Apostle Paul could kind of turn up anywhere and be able to be understood because he could speak, multiple languages, but particularly Greek. So this is the context. Rome, you can see in the center there, if you know your geography, I can't quite point to it, no pointer. Rome is the center of this universe, okay? And it's not like today. We have powerful countries in the world, don't we? We've got the United States, we've got China, okay? But it's hard to find a modern analogy. The closest thing, perhaps if we look back a few generations and look maybe at the British Empire, sort of. But these powerful countries that we have today, they don't control territory in the way that Rome did. Rome was the seat of government. The emperor sat on the throne. He, in fact, was the head of state for the whole of the Roman Empire, and people ultimately had to pay tribute to him in the form of taxes. And our hero in this story, or at least the story writer that we're reading, is Matthew. Matthew is a tax collector. He worked for Rome. And he actually was busy collecting money on behalf of the empire. And so the Romans were very good at organization. And have you heard the old expression, divide and conquer? Okay, well, this is what the Romans did. They kind of perfected the art of this. If you want to just pop the next slide up. Okay, so this was what Israel, or the Palestine looked like at the time of Jesus. You can see these coloured boxes here. These essentially are provinces in this period of time when Jesus was alive. And each of these provinces had a kind of a king or basically a puppet ruler that Rome had to pay tribute to Rome. And in the midst of that too, maybe just bring that next. Just click one more time. Just try to understand the politics of what was going on. You had these provincial kings, they were running their little pieces of territory. Okay, you had Roman officials, people like Pilate, who we're going to meet a little bit later at Easter time. And he was actually running the show for Rome from Jerusalem itself. And he was a governor there. So you need to sort of understand the politics of what's happening. And the other thing too, we talked about the Roman Empire. We had this, the Romans wisely allowed the Jews to kind of have their own little system of government as well. And that was expressed in the form of religious leaders and a Jewish council. And we talked about in our passage, there's the Sanhedrin. This was a Jewish council made up of chief priests, elders and scribes. Okay, there were 71 of them. They were all male. Okay, that was the times. And, they also had some responsibility in terms of government, but they all had to defer to Rome and to the various other leaders. You can see it's a mess. I also put the people in there. The reality is we find out in this passage that the leaders, particularly the Jewish leaders, they were afraid of the people. And there was good reason to be afraid of the people. Okay, so they came to Jesus when? In the middle of the night. They came to Jesus to arrest him there, because if they tried to arrest him in the temple courts when he was teaching, what do you think would have happened? Okay, there would have been a riot. There was thousands of extra people in Jerusalem at that time, and they were looking, so many of them. There was various groups in Jewish society. One of the key groups, there were zealots, okay? They were effectively revolutionaries. About 15 years earlier, there'd already been an attempted revolution that the Romans had put down. And in fact, not long after Jesus died in AD 70, the Romans came back finally, once and for all, and thought, we'll deal with this Jewish problem. And they completely sacked Jerusalem and left pretty much no stone on top of the other. And it was a very, very bad time. So this was the context. The other thing I want you to understand is the politics of what's happening with the people. The Judeans down the bottom, they thought they were the center of the Jewish universe. Jerusalem was there, wasn't it? Okay, this was the center, the temple. Okay, they're the most important Jews. But there were also Jews living in Galilee. Does Galilee ring any bells? That's where Jesus grew up, isn't it? But the way that the Galileans were viewed was not that well. And there's a great line in the Bible, can anything good come out of Galilee? And it's like, you can imagine someone living in a Vaucluse snob saying something like this in Sydney, can anything good come out of Campbelltown? That's kind of, I'm not meaning to be insulting, Greg. You guys came from Campbelltown, didn't you? Okay. All right, so that's the context of what this place was like, that they looked down their noses at these people. And you can see why Jesus was such a puzzle to them. What they didn't understand was, because they thought they were so wise, that the Messiah was going to come. He was going to come from, Bethlehem, but in part of Judea. That's where he was going to come from. And they thought, well, who is this upstart in Galilee, healing people, gathering kind of followers? And they could not accept him because he did not fit the mold of what they were expecting. You can see also, have everyone heard of Samaria? Samaria is a place in the middle there. And Samaria was a constant problem because the Jews hated the Samaritans. There was plenty of parables Jesus told about them. And look where the poor Jewish people who were needing to go on their annual pilgrimage to Jerusalem for the Passover, guess where they had to go through? They had to walk from the top there in yellow all the way through Samaria to get to Judea. So it's like there's this whole kind of complex political thing happening here. And Jesus represented an incredible threat to the status quo. The leaders were afraid of, they didn't like Rome being there in the first place, but the last thing they wanted to do was to have another rebellion which would ultimately cause Rome to come back with an even greater army and destroy them all. The other thing the Jewish leaders themselves were incredibly frustrated by is the fact that nobody listened to them as well as people listened to Jesus. Jesus was capturing hearts and minds. These Jewish leaders were so ensconced in their teaching and their kind of letter of the law ideas that in the end they actually completely missed even seeing who Jesus was. But there was an incredible jealousy. Power, it's a very, very deceptive thing. And when you give people absolute power, they get all sorts of things twisted up. So you can see that the political context Jesus came in, he was not welcome at all. And no wonder they wanted to put him to death. And for 3 years, they watched him. They waited for their opportunity. They actually thought, we need to get rid of this guy. How can we get rid of this guy? And their opportunity came through one of Jesus' closest followers, Judas. And we're going to meet Judas shortly. Okay, so there's the political reason that Jesus was a bit of a menace from their point of view. But the next question I want to address, and this is also in a way an answer to why did Jesus have to die? And there's a whole theological layer to this very question. And let's just go, Kai, we'll jump to the next slide. This is the question, is there another way to God? And if you just want to bring up this quote here, I love this quote, and I've got to acknowledge Phil Moore, absolutely love him. If you've never seen some of Phil Moore's books, I'd thoroughly recommend them. They're kind of pitched as a commentary. In reality, it's a magnificent sort of daily study that you can do to go through various books of the Bible. I love this quote. Our culture celebrates religious diversity and tolerates any belief except the intolerant belief that there is only one way to God. Now, all you've got to do is watch Q&A on the ABC for about half an hour, and you will see this actually at work. We're a funny society, we must be tolerant to all these things. But oh no, if you actually believe that there's only one way to God, you're in big trouble. And this is the culture that we live in. It's kind of the air that we breathe almost. It's hard to actually imagine what life will be like without it, because this is the culture that we've actually grown up in. We need to avoid being, causing offense by sort of sharing an idea that might cause somebody else to become upset. So I want to challenge our thinking this morning in this area. Okay, so tolerance is not a Bible word. Ooh, there's a bit of silence, isn't there? Okay, tolerance is not a Bible word. What is a Bible word? What are the fruits of the Spirit? Love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, gentleness, self-control. Okay? They're the fruits of the Spirit. Did you see tolerance in any one of those things? Okay? We're called to love. We're called to embrace people. Okay? But we're not necessarily called to allow an idea that is in fact not true to be spoken of as if it was true. Now, we can do that in a loving way. I'm all for that. But we've got to be super careful of this kind of concept of tolerance, because it's actually not a Bible word. And if we embrace the concept of tolerance too much, we can actually blunten the message of the gospel. Okay? Glenn's my friend, he's an engineer. I think of tolerance more as an engineering word. Now, if there's a kind of a plan or some sort of a diagram, and you see the word tolerance, builders would probably understand this as well. The tolerance of something, in fact, is the amount of error that can be sustained in a system without the whole thing falling to pieces. Now, we saw a dramatic kind of illustration of that, sadly, this week, that terrible kind of scaffolding collapse, and one poor young man lost his life in that, and someone else was seriously injured. But however this thing had been put together, there would have been rules about how you're meant to erect scaffolding and how much lean and how much kind of you could allow in order for something to stay standing. Okay, and that's sort of like tolerance, but in a way, it's like, if we allow this kind of concept of tolerance, in the end, the whole house kind of collapses around us. So I really want to challenge that. And I also, let's just maybe, Kai, jump down a little bit more. We didn't read this, okay, and I'm trusting that many of you will know this passage. But Gethsemane, that moment where Jesus actually went to pray before all these events took place, there was a time and he was saying in there, "My Father, if it is possible, may this cup be taken from me, yet not my will, but as you will." Okay? Now that prayer, Jesus prayed 3 times. And ultimately, his request for it to be taken from him wasn't granted, was it? Ultimately, an answer does emerge. However, that request to take this burden away from him was never actually relieved. Jesus was never relieved of that. Okay, this is an important question, because if you wrestle with this question, is there any other way to God? You're not alone. Jesus wrestled with it too. Because this is at the heart of what was going on for him. Now, he was facing incredible death and pain and suffering. Okay, we don't normally face that, although some of our brothers and sisters in other parts of the world do. But there was this kind of sense in which Jesus was weighing these things, but he knew his own very life was on the line. So let's just consider for a moment this kind of idea of tolerance, or everybody's kind of got their own way. And one of the parables that, you might have heard various forms of this, perhaps growing up. I know I did once or twice. But there was this parable that's sort of told, okay, dealing with kind of religions. And it said, there was 4 blind men, and they stumbled across an elephant in the jungle. Okay, and why you'd want to go anywhere near an elephant in the jungle? They're pretty big. But these blind men came across the elephant. One of them sort of encountered the leg of the elephant. He thought, wow, I know what an elephant's like. An elephant's strong and sturdy and like the trunk of a tree. That's what an elephant's like. Okay, and then another one sort of came, and he managed to he found the trunk. And he said, I know what an elephant's like. An elephant is, it's a bit sort of supple. It's almost like a big python or a snake. And then somebody else managed to grab hold of a tusk. Oh, I know what an elephant's like. It's hard and shiny and comes to a great big point. And somebody else kind of grabbed the tail. Oh, this is like a piece of old rope. Okay. And so this is the intent of the parable. And it sounds quite pious and important, but it actually is a false humility, because the meaning this parable is intended to convey is every religion claims to be right, but they are all blind men touching an elephant. All the world's religions hold parts of the truth. They just approach God in a different way. Now that all sounds kind of pious and nice, doesn't it? And you think, it sort of makes sense, doesn't it? All these blind men, they don't know. They can't see the elephant. All they're seeing is their part of it. But, the elephant is still there. You might have heard this parable told in another way. Maybe it's a mountain and there's lots of different roads and we're all taking different roads. But we're all going to arrive at the top of the mountain. Everything will be all right. What is the flaw in this argument? I could ask you, Chris, what's the flaw in the argument? That's true. They can't all be right. That's right. But even more so, perhaps if I put it in these terms for you, who is the narrator of the story? Okay? It assumes that the narrator of that story can see, that they're not blind and they can see the truth. Okay? The reality is, these narrators, doesn't matter what story you're narrating, they don't see the big picture. They're also blind. So how can you say, as Chris has rightly pointed out, how can you say that they can all be true? Because no one has seen all of it, and I would suggest, except for one person. I would trust Jesus to be my narrator. He's the only human being that has actually seen this side of the grave and the next. And Jesus was the one that said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father but by me. So I just want you to kind of look at all these things. It's too easy to accept these things that the world often comes and puts to us. The Bible sort of tells us that without the shedding of the blood, there can be no forgiveness of sin. Jesus knew this, and this is kind of why he went through with it. And you can cling, if you like, to that false parable, but in doing so, you need to understand that this is not what Christianity teaches. Salvation, Peter said, is found in no one else, for there is no other name under heaven given to men by which we must be saved. Even more incredibly, okay, we all know, I guess most of us in the room know what happens next. Okay, the cross, okay, is what I'm talking about. And Phil Moore put it this way. He said, if people can be saved without the cross of Jesus, then the Christian God is so nasty or foolish that he asked his son to die in pain simply to offer the world an extra choice in their catalogue of options for salvation. Can you see? Does that make sense to you? Why would Jesus die? This is the question he was wrestling with in Gethsemane. Lord, can you take this cup away? Yet not my will, but yours be done. And this is the importance of that choice. So let's have a little look. Hopefully that's helped you with that question. But let's look at, this was my third question. Okay, why did Judas betray? Why did Judas, let's go to question 3, Kai. He's there? There, yep. There we go. Why did Judas betray Jesus? Now, I didn't have a picture of Judas. I don't know if anybody does. So I chose this bloke. Who knows who this is? Let's see if there are any other sort of students of history. Thank you. Yeah, Che Guevara. Now, he was a revolutionary. He was born in Argentina. I think he's traced his ancestry back to where was it? Sorry? Oh, no, not Judas. He traced his ancestry, I think, somewhere back to Ireland, funnily enough. But anyway, he was a good-looking fellow. And he started out probably well with good intentions. By the end of his life, he'd summarily executed probably several hundred people as far as we know. He was not a nice character. There's some people still hold him out to be a hero. But he was the best I could come up with. So I got this question, why did Judas betray Jesus? So if we just have a look at that first section here. We've got to remember that Judas, in fact, had been with Jesus the whole time. He was called. Jesus actually prayed, didn't he, when he chose his first disciples or the people who later became apostles. Judas was one of the guys. He actually looked the part. He was an impressive person. Our friend Matthew, who wrote the Gospel of Matthew, he was a tax collector, and yet Judas was the guy who was given charge of the money in Jesus' actual team of people that he had around him. The other disciples all thought Judas was a pretty cool dude. He actually, looked the part. He sounded the part. He was following along, doing all the things. He saw all the miracles. Okay, he, in fact, we later find out he'd actually been pilfering. He'd been taking money out of the treasury that they had together, and in fact, skimming a bit off the top. But that was not revealed to the other disciples. And yet it's interesting, isn't it, that Jesus, in that, being aware of that, he still chose to trust him in this area of weakness, perhaps hoping, as we often, we let Jesus down all the time, don't we? But Jesus still entrusts us with things and hopes that we will actually come through for him in those moments. Sadly, that wasn't to be the case with Judas, though. He actually, a few days before, had been to see the Jewish leaders. And we've got to sort of look at why. How could he end up in this place? He actually, maybe if you jump down to this next thing. So, good. So, he'd been to see the Jewish leaders. This was only days before the Last Supper. And it was the last straw for him. There was a moment where I think someone came to anoint Jesus just before, before all these events took place. And there was a very, very, very expensive bottle of perfume that this dear lady had actually taken, and she'd poured out on Jesus' feet, and she'd anointed him in this way. And Jesus didn't rebuke her. He received it. She was worshipping. Okay, it was a lovely, lovely gesture. Judas, though, he saw dollar signs. He sort of looked at it and thought, surely this thing, I don't know, how much can you pay? Ladies, tell me, how expensive can perfume be? Sorry? Yeah, too much. Yeah, fair enough. This bottle of perfume was effectively worth a year's wages. It was a staggering amount, and yet it was poured out in this beautiful moment of surrender and of worship to Jesus. Judas, something inside him snapped when he saw this happening. This bottle could have been sold, we could have given the money to the poor, and I could have got my bit off the top as well. Who knows? That we don't really know. It's hard to get inside Judas's head, but this was clearly the last straw. He then went to see the chief priests. They rubbed their hands with glee. Okay, finally we have an opportunity. There was no facial recognition software and security cameras to recognize Jesus in those days. They didn't know how to find him, and he was camped out on the Mount of Olives. Judas knew the place, didn't he? And he went to see the chief priest, and he said, I'll turn this guy in. And they said, what's it going to cost us? He said, 30 pieces of silver. Now, I don't know what you think silver's worth. That probably seemed like a lot of money. I looked at it because silver seems like an expensive thing. This was probably the equivalent of maybe a month's wages for a Roman soldier. It was not a lot of money. And in fact, it's all makes it all the more pathetic. But why did Judas get to this stage? Later on, he was ultimately filled with terrible remorse and he took his own life. Maybe, Kai, if you want to just jump down to this next section and the one below. And I think what we've got to understand in Judas is as he's looking at this, all these things unfolding around him, like Che Guevara, he was actually looking for a different kind of revolution. And this kingdom of God that he'd somehow stumbled into or been called into, he didn't get it. It wasn't what he was picturing at all. And Fillmore said, Judas's heart had been slowly enveloped by a creeping disappointment with the meek and humble Messiah for whom he had given up everything to follow. This was not who he was expecting. Just like the chief priests and the teachers of the law, the Jesus they met was not the Messiah that they were expecting. Nevertheless, the Jewish leaders were profoundly excited that they finally had an inside man, and they looked for a way to betray Jesus in this moment. Ultimately, being afraid of the people like the cowards that they were, they chose nighttime. And they arrested Jesus, as we know from the story. And that's almost the end of Judas's part, except that we later find in his remorse, he thought, he knew Jesus. This is the thing. Like, he was his friend. He knew him. And he regretted what he'd done. He took the 30 pieces of silver, he went back before the chief priests, and he threw them on the ground in front of them and said, take this back, I don't want this anymore. And they, in their pious kind of, these guys, they were a piece of work. In their piety, they thought, well, this is blood money. They're the ones that paid the stupid this amount of money. But they, in their piety, thought, oh, we can't touch that. So they thought they used some money to buy a small field, which was used to bury foreigners who they didn't really like much either. So these guys, I'm not painting a good picture of these Jewish rulers, am I? They're a bunch of snakes in the grass, really, and we're going to meet a few of them in a second. And then Judas, the one place he could have looked to find actually forgiveness and salvation was the one place he didn't look. Instead of looking to Jesus, he went back to the chief priest. Instead of looking to God, he actually looked and he regretted what he'd done, but he was so filled with remorse, he took his own life. So he's a complex character, and that was really, as best we can understand, what he was thinking and the why behind it. So let's actually look now at Jesus and this incredible trial. So first of all, we have to ask a question. How did Jesus, in fact, survive this whole process, this incredible ordeal? And I would say that I think the main place for that actually comes from Gethsemane. Okay, so Kai, do you want to just reveal the whole of this slide, just down to the bottom there? And I love Philip Yancey. He writes, there's a book he wrote, which many of you would probably have read, called What's So Amazing About Grace. We need to recognize that this moment for Jesus was no trivial thing. He said, my soul is overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death. I, for one, am glad that the Jesus that we know and love did not approach this with some sort of, stoic, thing where he showed no emotion, and you can see the turmoil, you can see the level of anxiety here. But in this time where he poured out his heart to his Father, this is what Yancey says: a dramatic change took place. Between that scene in the garden and what follows, the gospel accounts of Gethsemane show a person in anguish. Afterwards, they show one who, more than Pilate, more than Herod, seems in utter control. At his trials, Jesus is no victim. He is serene, unflappable, and the master of his destiny. So this is how Jesus was equipped, in a sense, to go into that moment. And I don't know, many of you are new to this church, and it's a delight to me, actually. I think Chris and Ruth are somewhere here. Whereabouts are you guys? Yeah, there we are. Chris is still here. Chris and Ruth were part of the church here in the early days. And I don't know, and the Lees will remember this, maybe the Littles as well. 19 years ago, there was a moment where this church, in fact, as you know it now, would not have been and not have continued. We'd just gone through a terrible kind of breakdown in the leadership, and the church was really struggling. And most of us really were ready to go our separate ways, weren't we, Katrina? I remember turning up to a prayer meeting at Chris and Ruth's house, and all of us had more or less decided, well, it's over. We need to go. We'll shrink off into somewhere and maybe lick our wounds and find another place to go. But in that moment, that prayer meeting changed everything. God met us in that moment. And in that moment, we left actually as different people. And God very clearly spoke, and he said, I haven't finished with you yet. And even now, as I'm remembering that moment, I still feel the emotion of that, because God still hasn't finished with us now. And the testimony to that truth, the truth of that moment, is just the fact that you're all sitting here today. God hasn't finished with us yet. God hasn't finished with you yet. And in those moments where we actually pour out our heart to God and we trust him, we come to him like that, they can be transformative, and it doesn't matter what we have to go through. We can actually endure it because of the grace and the love of God. So let's have a quick look at the revolution on trial. And this is a creepy cast of characters here. Maybe just bring up the whole slide, Kai, if you want to come to the next one, the revolution on trial. Okay, so we've got Annas, the high priest. This guy was the invisible hand, the kingmaker. This was where Jesus was taken straight after he was arrested. This was the despicable human being that came up with the trumped-up charges and sent the group of people actually to attack and to bring Jesus in. And you've got Caiaphas. He's the son-in-law of Annas. Annas wasn't the high priest. He'd been thrown out. He was still busy pulling the strings behind the scenes. And then you've got his creepy son-in-law, Caiaphas, who was too spineless probably to stand up to his father-in-law. He was high priest at the time, and he sort of was overseeing things. They'd organised all these false witnesses. They'd had 3 years to come up with a case. And guess what? Even their false witnesses couldn't agree. You follow me around for 3.5 hours, I guarantee you'll find something wrong with what I do. They'd had 3 years. They found nothing on Jesus. They had to actually bring in false witnesses. In the end, through all this trial, there was 3 trials. He was taken to see Annas first of all. Then he went to Caiaphas' palace after that he'd been to Annas' home. And then finally he ends up, dawn is breaking over Jerusalem. And they called the whole council together, 71 sort of elders and leaders of Jerusalem. And in the end, who actually convicts Jesus? Jesus himself. In those moments, he could have argued his case and he could have got off. That's not what he was trying to do. We know he had the capacity to make a good argument. The chief priests also knew that. In the end, Caiaphas said, I charge you under oath, tell me, are you the Son of God? Jesus, in that, actually said, yes, it is as you say. I'm the Messiah, knowing full well how they would actually misinterpret what he was saying. Why did they react so violently? Because to them, you, a mere man, are claiming to be God. If you're going to make that claim, you've got to back it up. Jesus did. This is why I love him so much. He was the real deal. They couldn't make a case. False witnesses came forward. In the end, the only thing they had on him was, "You're the Son of God." Guess what? He was. But this was all that they needed. This guy, he's committed blasphemy. Let's get rid of him. And that was ultimately what they sought to do. Now, I'm going to leave Peter alone entirely because I'm almost out of time. Thank you for listening. You've been really good, actually. It's been great. But we're going to have to leave Peter. So just quickly skip through this next slide. Sandra, I leave this in your capable hands. I love Peter, okay? He's a great character in the Bible. While the other disciples all wanted to run, Peter was the only one who stood up and fought. He was the only one who actually followed Jesus and actually did his best for him. And yet he still denied him. But Sandra's going to follow up on Peter next week, and he's an amazing person. But let's kind of bring this to a bit of a conclusion. So we'll go to the final slide here, Kai. Okay. How was Jesus' prayer answered? When Jesus prayed to the one who could save him from death, he did not get that salvation. Instead, he got salvation for the entire world. This is how it was answered. And in these moments that should have been the darkest time for the revolution, okay, actually were the time that we can look back on and think God totally transformed and surprised everybody in this situation. I love Winston Churchill's quote. He was talking about the Battle of El Alamein, but who cares, okay? He's always a good one to quote, isn't he? Good old Winston, unless you're a Labour supporter. Look at Tony over here. All right. I can't do Churchill's voice, but you'll have to trust me with this. He says, I really want to do it in Churchill's voice, but no, this is not the end. No, I better not do it. He said, "Now this is not the end. It is not even the beginning of the end, but it is perhaps the end of the beginning." The revolution hadn't collapsed at all. In fact, it was actually just getting started. And we'll give Phil Moore the final word, and we'll finish on this. Astonishingly, the trials which could have destroyed the radical message of Jesus were the very trials which proved it to be true. He only stood before his judges because he chose not to resist them and kept silent in the knowledge that just one well-placed reply was all it would take for him to walk free. His judges could not destroy his revolution. They merely demonstrated its power to the world. As they blindfolded and beat him, he turned the other cheek in a silent but powerful sermon of love. As they flogged him and offered him mock worship, he forgave his enemies and prayed for those who persecuted him. As they nailed him to a cross and hoisted him up there before the crowd, stripped of all covering except his own blood, still he loved, still he forgave, still he demonstrated another way of life. The crucifixion did not destroy King Jesus and his kingdom revolution. The cross became a pulpit from which Jesus the Messiah preached once and for all to the world that God's love is greater than humanity's sin, and that neither pain nor injustice nor torture nor even death could ever exhaust the compassion of God towards the ugly rebels who dwell on planet Earth. Jesus of Nazareth cried out and died, but his radical message had never shone brighter. The leaders of the Jewish religion have been exposed as envious hypocrites who cared nothing for justice but only for self. The Roman Empire had been exposed as a spineless, false saviour which lusted for power but lacked the character to use it when the world needed it most. But King Jesus had been exposed as the one who loved, forgave, and endured unto death, validating his revolution with a signature written in his own blood. The revolution had been put on trial, and the crushed and crucified king who was laid in Joseph's tomb had won. Hallelujah. Let's finish there. Praise God.